Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 63. Just a few short bits of channel opening, I really mean it this time, so just heads up, you've got one more week for the light cruiser design competition. And separately, just to let everybody know that we are now hosting channel community events every Friday evening. We have two separate events, one in EU time and one in US time, which necessarily is somewhat later. And at the moment, we're playing around in World of Warships, but if we can come across something else that a bunch of community members have and we can all play together with, then we'll do that instead, or as well as, or whatever. At the moment, we're basically just using a training room and semi-recreating a bunch of vaguely historical scenarios, and then laughing at the hilarious results that usually ensue. Some of those will be featured on live streams as background replays and such. So yeah, if you want to join in, I'd advise joining the Discord server, as that's how we communicate with everybody. And if anyone has any ideas for other community event programs or whatever that we could use, then we can do that as well. So yeah, anyway, on with questions. Oh yes, sorry, one other thing before I forget. Rejoice, for the SoundCloud issues seem to have resolved themselves, so by the time you're listening to this, the backlog of Drydocks on SoundCloud should have been uploaded. Anyway, this week's questions are taken from the USS Vesuvius and Midget submarine videos, so let's get on with those. Giovanni Favulo asks, how can we classify the Italia and the Italia class? Because I don't think that Battleship is the right classification. So, for those of you who are unaware, the Italia class were a pair of battleships designed by the relatively famous Italian designer Benedetto Brin, and they're unusual for a number of reasons, in that compared to other battleships that were built at the time, which was the mid-1870s, they were very fast. They're almost capable of 18 knots. Now, that might not sound a lot. You might think, oh, sort of standard speed of a pre-dreadnought, bit slow for a dreadnought, or what's the big deal? Well, yes, true, but this isn't even the pre-dreadnought era. This is about the middle of the ironclad era, at which point most of the sort of battleship ironclads are making 12 to 15 knots, give or take. No one else really got much faster than that, and quite a number were slower. So 3-knot speed advantage is quite considerable. I mean, we go to the pre-dreadnought era, and the pre-dreadnoughts, when they were able to generally be travelling around 18 knots, and Dreadnought came along, one of its big features was its supposed massively great speed advantage, which was 21 knots, which is that same 3-knot speed margin. So, and I mean, again, the Queen Elizabeth class fast battleships, when they came out, the average speed of most dreadnoughts was 21 knots, and they could make, well, on paper 25 knots, in practice more like 24, but again it's that 3-knot speed advantage. So if those ships are seen as having a radical speed advantage, the Italia class definitely did as well. The other two things that distinguished them was complete lack of belt armour, and the fact that they used this some of the savings resulting from that weight for an absolutely colossal battery of 4 17-inch guns, mounted not quite, well, amidships within echelon pairs. So it was basically, on paper, it looked like a gigantic fast-floating glass cannon. And I guess this is where the question comes from, do we class them as a battleship? Because there's the conception of a battleship as obviously needing an armoured belt. Personally, I'd still put them as battleships for two reasons. One is that exactly what a battleship was in the ironclad era is a very mutable subject. It was probably the period of widest experimentation in what did and didn't constitute a capital warship. So the Italia class, although they're unusual, they're certainly not alone in being on the very weird end of the spectrum. And the other thing is, yes, everyone thinks of a battleship as big guns, heavy armour, etc., etc. But what actually is a battleship? Well, the definition of the term comes all the way back to the Age of Sail. It's a ship capable of standing in the line of battle, i.e. a line of battleship. They just dropped the line of part. And in that respect, could the Italia stand in the line of battle? It was designed to. Some people call them proto-battle cruisers. I don't agree with that, because a battle cruiser, in both circumstances of its evolution, both pre-World War One and immediately pre and during World War Two, the battle cruiser's aim was to hunt enemy cruisers. The Italia class was not designed to hunt enemy cruisers. The Italia class was designed to fight enemy battleships. So it was a ship. It was designed to stand in the line of battle, albeit a very fast line of battle. So I'd argue it's a battleship. And the other thing is, yes, it doesn't have belt armor. That doesn't make it terribly protected. It had a very thick deck for the period, 4 inches thick deck. I mean, obviously it's an ironclad battleship, not a steel battleship, so the protection isn't quite the same. But then again, you're facing off against 1870s era guns. So between the massive compartmentalization and the sloped 4-inch deck, the protection scheme, we never obviously got to see quite how that performed in battle, but the idea of the ship needs to be very well protected on the vitals was still there. It was just accomplished in a somewhat different manner. So overall, protection, yeah, it's there. As I say, it's just different. Guns, well, definitely. And it's designed to fight other battleships in the line of battle. So I'd say the Italia class are very definitely ironclad battleships. They're just not what we usually think of. Nico de Fuerluxa, I think, asks, the stern section of HMS Hood, why was it so low above the water? Did this design cause issues when the ship was in rough seas? Well, the answer comes in two parts, really. So, yes, it did cause a number of issues when the ship was in rough seas, or indeed any sea above flat calm, to the extent that within the Royal Navy it was sometimes known as Her Majesty's largest submarine. But as for why, this wasn't actually an intentional design choice. Now, Hood, yes, the aft deck was stepped down, but that's not exactly a new feature. If you look at pictures of the Lion-class battle cruisers, etc., this was a design feature that had been present on fast British capital ships for some time. However, the Admiral class as designed were, should we say, somewhat lighter. They were designed very much in the vein of the next evolution of the Lion, Queen Mary, Princess Royal, Tiger type of battlecruiser. Then Jutland happened, and all of a sudden people were slightly more interested in seeing that the battlecruiser should be somewhat better protected. Repulse and Renown, obviously, much more underway, had to be given extra refits of armour once they've been completed. Hood was too far advanced for them to just rework the design completely from scratch, so they had to work in extra armour to the design rather than reconfiguring the ship's entire structure to compensate for the extra weight of armour. As a result, when she launched, although she was fairly well protected for the time, she did weigh considerably more than they'd initially bargained for, and in the interwar period, although she didn't get as many refits or the modernizations that some of her relatives in the Royal Navy capital ship fleet did, she did acquire a number of additional weapon systems, sensor systems, and other refitted items, and this all added weight. So between the fact that she was already overweight and thus sat lower in the water than was intended when she launched, plus the additional weight from extra stuff that was stuck on her in the interwar period, plus the fact that, well, as anybody who's seen any kind of watercraft going fast knows, you tend to get a slight bow up and a slight stern down attitude when you're going at speed, which obviously Hood being a battlecruiser would tend to do. This all meant that the aft portion of the ship, which obviously with that cut down had never been the highest above the water in the first place, suddenly ended up pretty close to the water, and so any kind of circumstance that would cause the sea level to rise above the nominal 0 point, so rough seas, high speed, etc., etc., and all of a sudden the aft deck is very much awash. So yeah, that's why it was so low above the water. If her three sister ships had been completed, they had been revised to a fairly modified design because they hadn't been really started in any appreciable manner. So they wouldn't have had the same problems, and it's highly unlikely Hood would have had the same problem had she been modernised and refitted as they originally planned to do. Arctic Tiger asks for some clarification. Did the Germans refer to their ships as he or she? Well, there are quite a few issues surrounding the fact that obviously German is not English, and therefore how they refer to things does not have an exact parallel with English. I'm sure a number of the German-speaking historical YouTubers have covered this question before, and probably in a lot more detail since, well, it is their language. But the two things I would note is one, that quite often when you're formally referring to a German ship, they seem to refer to the ship with reference to its class. So whereas we might say in English HMS Rodney or USS Alabama or something like that, quite often in the more formal form, the Germans seem to like saying something like, in German obviously, the battleship Bismarck, which would be Das Schlachtschiff Bismarck, with apologies to any German speaker who just heard that horrible butchery of their language. But anyway, you get the points. And at that point, the Das is referring to the class type. So if you hear like about Der Cruiser or something, or Der Kreuzer, I think, isn't it? The Der is referring to the Kreuzer, not, say, Admiral Hipper or Blücher or whatever. Now, if you were going to try and refer to Bismarck in German in the masculine sense, you would say Der Bismarck, but from what I understand, that grammatically doesn't make any sense. And most German speakers and German sources these days that I've seen tend to refer to it as Die Bismarck, which is the feminine form, which is would that be calling the ship a she, which is pretty much what most other people do. Now, where it comes with this whole thing about whether or not Bismarck is a he, a masculine, is from Captain Lindemann, who, well, he gave a speech, effectively said, this ship is so big and so massive and so huge and so powerful, it can't possibly be female, it must be male, therefore everyone must call it he. Go and look up the exact text of the speech if you want. But that was basically the gist of what he was saying. Which is more a propaganda sort of, oh, look at me, I've got such a big battleship, insert relevant compensation joke here thing. So, yeah, the more interesting part of that speech is that, in particular, he says, I don't want anyone to call the Bismarck she anymore. It should be a he. Which means that everyone before that was calling about the ship Die Bismarck, which is the feminine form, which kind of answers the argument right there. It's the general common usage appears to have been that ships in German were feminine, just the same as they are in English. And this was just a particular thing of Lindemann's that he wanted to go with, and some of the crew decided to adopt. Alvman asks, when magazines are flooded in an emergency, what is the process involved? How dangerous is the process to nearby crew? Can the flooded material still be used? Now, okay, fine, that's the shell room, technically. Not where the charges are stored, but whatever, you get the general idea. Now, it has been pointed out to me, I have recently been answering multi-part questions in the correct order. This is heresy and must not be stood for. So, in reverse order, can the flooded material still be used? No. Basically is the answer. A lot of the time, on some certain ships, the charges were stored in the open. Well, the shells as well, as you can see. Within the magazines, so given that they're in silk bags and they've just been immersed in seawater and who knows what else pollutants have been washed in as well, yeah, you do not want to be trusting your life to that, never mind the fact that a lot of explosives would be completely ruined by immersion in water. Now, fair enough. Some battleships would store some or all of their explosive charges in sealed containers, and a lot of battleships would at least store some of them in sealed containers. But one, you don't know how watertight those containers are, and two, to be perfectly honest, if you're in a circumstance where you're going to need to be flooding the magazine, chances are the ship's probably taken a fair few in heavy blows, which will probably, amongst other things, have damaged the seals on the containers. So again, you don't want to be trusting to that at all in any way, shape, or form. So no, you couldn't just drain the magazines and go, oh, okay, we'll use the charges again. Not unless you either like a completely damp squib or a catastrophic explosion, which is kind of what you've been trying to avoid by flooding the magazines. How dangerous is the process to nearby crew? Very. And this kind of links in with what's the process involved. The process involved basically involves opening a series of valves. It can just be one big one, but that's a bit of a safety hazard. But basically, it involves opening valves that let in an awful lot of seawater under an awful lot of pressure very, very quickly. Because ultimately, when you have several hundred tons of explosive going off and you think there's a chance they might catch fire and take the ship with you, you want to cut that risk out pretty darn quickly. So a garden hose or whatever's not going to cut it. You need hundreds of possibly thousands of gallons of water in there right this minute, preferably 2 minutes ago. So there's high pressure, high volume water. That in and of itself is very dangerous. Obviously, you are flooding part of the ship intentionally, so anyone who's in that magazine needs to get out pretty sharpish, and that generally can be quite difficult. So, especially because you don't have the luxury of saying, well, we're going to flood the magazine, can everyone please file out in an orderly manner, because by that time everything's probably exploded. And again, similar to the first answer, if you're considering flooding the magazines, chances are something's already gone horribly wrong. So you probably have other very lethal dangers to worry about at the time, which the act of flooding the magazine is just going to make that situation even more complicated, which in a dangerous situation means even more dangerous, basically. So, yeah, obviously, ideally, you would seal any and all hatches involved, but for obvious reasons, the magazines tended to be fairly self-contained and sealed anyway. So it's more about closing hatches vertically than horizontally in most cases. And as for just how lethal these things could be, there's a reason why an awful lot of people who flooded ships' magazines and saved the ship by doing so ended up being awarded those medals posthumously. These questions have all come from the USS Vesuvius video, so that puts a bit of context into the next question, which is from Harry Fuller, who asks, what other failed technologies would have been interesting if they'd worked better? Dirigibles, perhaps, or something else? Well, if it had lived up to its initial promise, the rigid airship, as so lovingly modelled here by USS Akron, would really have been a rather interesting one to see pan out if they'd just worked a bit better. And the reason for that is that, actually, to be honest, up until probably the late 1930s, maybe even going into the early 1940s. On paper, the rigid airship actually makes an excellent addition to the world's navies, because up until the mid to late part of the Second World War, nobody had aircraft that could cover entire oceans, like, say, the Atlantic, from land bases. And now, yes, fair enough, you could have aircraft carriers, but aircraft carrier aircraft outside of the late 1930s Japanese innovations tended to have pretty short ranges as well, and aircraft carriers couldn't be everywhere. So for recon purposes, patrolling purposes, and even to a degree fleet shadowing and attack purposes, a big rigid airship would have actually been really useful. because they can go anywhere. They're nowhere near as limited range-wise as aircraft are. Now, fair enough, obviously land-based aircraft had pretty much got the mastery over rigid airships by the end of the First World War, but this is the point, out at sea, you're not going to run into those. Now, okay, carrier fighters maybe could be a problem, but, well, with things like the Akron, in theory, they could carry their own little fighter defense squadron, so that may not be quite as severe a problem as you might otherwise think. They could obviously fly very high, so although obviously they would be vulnerable to the fleet's anti-aircraft fire, they could in theory fly high enough to avoid some or all of it, which would be very useful for them shadowing and spotting the fall of shot, etc. And even to a certain degree, maybe even as commerce raiders. I'm not so convinced about that, but because it would be fairly easy to mount an obsolete 4-inch anti-aircraft gun on a merchant ship, and that would make it very difficult for the airship to approach. But again, if the airship aircraft carrier had worked out, the airship could stand off at range and launch fighters or fighter bombers to strafe and bomb the ship in question. And although an airship is relatively slow as far as aircraft go, it's a heck of a lot faster than the average commerce raider. And of course, since it can fly, it can go over land. So even if somehow you're being chased down by an enemy aircraft carrier, you can just divert over another country, and what they're going to do about it at that point, especially considering where a lot of commerce raiders operated in that period. So yeah, I think that would have been a really interesting technology if it had actually worked out a bit better than it historically did. The good old rigid flying aircraft carrier dash general rigid airship. Josh Thomas Moore asks, how hard was it to identify targets for aircraft at sea, such as with HMS Sheffield being misidentified as the Bismarck and the Japanese not realising they'd hit USS Yorktown twice? It could be quite hard, believe it or not, and there's a number of factors involved, and not least of which is battleships are big, the Earth is considerably larger, and things tend to start to look very small once you start to get up relatively high. So a lot of the time you would try and identify ships by common features. So this is why things like silhouettes and basic diagrams were usually a lot more helpful than detailed pictures, because to be honest, if you were close enough to a hostile ship that a detailed picture would help you figure out which ship it was, you were probably far too close. So take, for example, this. I mean, okay, fair enough. This is an extract from Google Earth, but this is a battleship in the United States, and this picture is taken from an apparent altitude of about just over 3,000 feet. Now, realistically, at this point, what actually can you see? If you're flying along, and bear in mind, if you're flying along, there'll be clouds in the way, there'll be waves and spray, possibly anti-aircraft fire, sea mist or haze, poor lighting conditions. So this is very much idealized. As I say, so what actually can you tell about this ship? Well, it's got 2 turrets at the front and 1 at the back, and a superstructure that looks vaguely American in the middle. You're not really going to be telling much more than that. I mean, you might guess at a class. I mean, okay, so you know from the turret layout that it's going to be North Carolina, or South Dakota, or an Iowa, and you might start drawing inferences if you know, perhaps, say, that the Iowa is exceptionally long. You might think, okay, this is a bit stubbier, so it's not one of them. And there are other few clues that might help you work things out from this altitude. But as I said, this is just about 3,000 feet. Unless cloud cover forced people lower, aircraft recon tended to operate a lot higher than that when they're on the sort of spotting part of their flight, because this is well within anti-aircraft range. Now, what can you tell from this picture? This is from an apparent altitude of around about 6,000 feet, which is about the kind of altitude something like a swordfish would be flying when it's on its look for the enemy part of the mission. Now, what detail can you make out at this point? Well, again, you can just about make out the turret detail. That's really about it. Maybe, if you're lucky, you can make out profile information, a little bit of the shape. And say you might know because of the distinctive bow shape this isn't an Iowa, but from this altitude, are you really going to be able to pick out exactly which ship it is, whether it's a North Carolina or a South Dakota? I mean, for those of us who are obsessive naval historians, we probably can do, but just to put everyone's minds at ease, this is in fact USS Alabama, a South Dakota class battleship. But you can kind of see the problem. And I say this is in very much ideal condition, so add in all the other bits I mentioned earlier, and identification becomes even harder. So a lot of the time, you would be, I mean, you're definitely not going to be able to see the number of guns at this point, just the fact that there are turrets and maybe that there are guns. So you can kind of understand, factoring in all the weather conditions and such, why the Swordfish made the mistake of thinking Sheffield was Bismarck. One of the things a lot of people tend to fail to appreciate is that actually cruisers were very long. I mentioned in the Battle of the North Cape video that one of the reasons why the Scharnhorst crew may well have mistaken one of the County class cruisers for a battleship was because it was actually about the size of a Revenge class battleship and it had 4 turrets. So in the gloom, it's like, well, it's the right size, it's got 4 twin turrets, and it seems to be making an awful lot of flash and fire. It must be a battleship because that's about all the information we can get out of it. So when you think about the situation of Sheffield being attacked by the Swordfish, well, here's Sheffield's half-sister HMS Belfast, now in London, from that same 6,000-foot altitude. Yeah, how much information are you going to get out of that? They basically was expecting to find a 4-turreted ship sailing in the general direction that they were going, and they saw a 4-turreted ship sailing in the general direction that they were going, and that was pretty much all the information they could really make out at that point, especially considering the weather was not good, nor was the light levels, and hence the attack. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a little bit more appreciation of just how difficult it is to actually work out what is what from any kind of appreciable altitude when you're not looking for something with a very distinctive profile. Josh Thomas Moore asks, if you had to work on one of the small submarines, which would you go for, and which would you bring a note from your doctor for on the day of operation? Unsurprisingly, we have moved on a question or two back onto videos from the midget submarine video. So I'll start off by saying I wouldn't bother with either choice when it comes to the Japanese midget submarines because, well, a lot of them ended up being either intentional or unintentional suicide missions, which I've no interest in going on, but being that most of them had at least some element of suicidal mission profile in them, I doubt they would have accepted a doctor's note. So, that aside, from the 2 other largest operators of midget submarines in the Second World War, I would go for the Italian one, specifically the CB class, as illustrated here, largely on the grounds that I don't like drowning, especially not in a submarine, let alone a midget submarine, and the CB class generally, unless there were 1 or 2 in Axis hands, tended to actually have a fairly good survival rate. Most of the CBs that were sunk ended up were ones that were scuttled or were sunk in harbour by air raids. Very few were actually lost on patrol, and I say most of those that were lost on patrol were lost while they were in Axis hands. So the Italians seem to have got that whole idea of midget submarines, etc., right to the greatest extent for the various powers that used them in the Second World War. As far as bringing a doctor's note for the day of operation where it would actually matter, any operation run by the British, really. They did pull off a number of successes, like the X-Craft against the Tirpitz, etc., etc. But as you would have gathered from watching the video, almost every British operation in which midget submarines or similar small underwater craft were used usually had at least one of them go wrong and disappear without a trace taking its crew with it, sometimes more. And yeah, if you're going to be rolling the dice to see whether or not you survive, to be perfectly honest, you're much more likely to survive as an Italian midget submarine operator than you are as anybody else's midget submarine operator. Kyla Stern asked, would it be possible for Germany to sink significant portions of the Royal Navy with a Pearl Harbor-style attack using U-boats? So this would involve attacking Scapa Flow. Um, at the beginning of World War One, well, the British based the Grand Fleet for a while over in Northern Ireland. So yeah, good luck with that. Um, in World War Two, and obviously they moved back to Scaffold once they'd increased the defences. In World War Two, it's theoretically marginally more possible, but the kind of tensions between Britain and Germany would have been on the increase, and the British tended to pay a lot more attention to the security of their fleet than necessarily the Americans did when it came to Pearl Harbor. Obviously, there is a whole issue around that about the lack of information flow, which was addressed in a previous Drydock. But basically, the long and the short bit is the British fleet was slightly more prepared during the rising tensions with Germany for a surprise attack than the Americans were at Pearl Harbor. But anyway, Scapa flow, as was proven by Royal Oak, could be penetrated by German submarines. However, there were anti-submarine patrols, there were anti-submarine nets, there were anti-submarine block ships, etc., etc. It just so happened the defences weren't quite as complete as the British thought they were. However, it did take someone with the exceptional skills of Gunther Preen and a fair bit of luck to be able to get into Scapa flow. So, whilst obviously the defences could be breached by a particularly skilled captain, I don't think the idea of sending in mass numbers of U-boats to pull off a kind of Pearl Harbor mass torpedoing of the Royal Navy in Scapa flow would have worked. And in actual fact, it probably wouldn't have worked, period. You wouldn't even have got Royal Oak, because it's incredibly likely that since most U-boat captains weren't Gunther Preen, at least one or more would have been spotted, or gone aground, or in some other manner been detected, at which point the alarm would have been raised, patrols would have been stepped up, and that would have closed the window of opportunity that he used to get in. So, theoretically, if everything goes absolutely right, there are weaknesses in Scapa flow that could technically allow for it, but practically, given the overall relative differences in skill and technology across the U-boat fleet and the difficulty level involved in actually carrying out that mission, realistically, probably not. Blue Marlin 81 asks a pair of fairly complicated questions. He says, I've noticed the British maintain the traditional elliptical hull form on their later capital ships, whereas the US went to more of a wedge-shaped design with more beam toward the stern. Yamato also followed US design here. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? And goes on to speak a lot about the fine details. Also, who would you take in a 1v1 matchup between an Iowa and a modernised G3 with the same armour scheme but typical World War II radar and fire control upgrades, and similar matchup against the South Dakota? Okay, so we're going with the last question first. A modernised G3 versus a South Dakota. I'm gonna have to give that as a fairly neat advantage to the modernised G3. It's much more heavily protected, as you mentioned. It's a heck of a lot faster, so it can dictate the engagement range. We've addressed the fire control issues by saying it's modernised, and yes, it has the guns that the Nelsons used, but a fully built G3 is going to have a lot fewer problems compared to Nelson and Rodney, because a lot of their problems, not all of them, but a lot of the problems with their guns stemmed from the fact that the mountings had been so massively pared down to try and fit in the new displacement requirements. And also, we're saying, well, modernised, and by the time of World War II, most of the issues with Nelson Rodney's guns had been worked out. So with fewer issues to start with, the modernised G3 in the World War II context, its guns are pretty much going to be working as well as anybody else's. Now, whilst the South Dakota's more modern 16-inch guns are better at armour penetration than the 16-inch guns on the G3, as we said before, the G3 is more heavily armoured in the first place, and B, at practical battle ranges, the G3's guns are still going to be capable of punching into South Dakota in most places that matter. Well, not necessarily all, but most, and well, vice versa, really. So, and also it's slightly larger, so it can absorb a bit more damage, which is just simple rule of mathematics. And finally, the fact is that although the 16-inch gun on the G3 uses a relatively lightweight shell for British practice, its bursting charge is still significantly more powerful than that on the shell for the South Dakota, which means that individual shells that penetrate and detonate or hit the ship and detonate are going to inflict more damage per hit than the South Dakota shells are, assuming similar areas of detonation. So, given those values and the fact that, as I said, the G3 can, thanks to its superior speed, choose the engagement range pretty much to its preference, I'd say overall, in a South Dakota versus modernised G3, the G3's got a fairly comfortable advantage. When it comes up against an Iowa, well, the Iowa uses pretty much the same armour scheme as the South Dakota, so the arguments about who is and isn't better protected armour-wise are pretty much the same in absolute terms of resistance. However, the Iowa can match the G3 or the modernised G3 for speed, at the very least, if not possibly exceed it, considering the G3s as modernised may be heavier and therefore slower, albeit they may as well have modernised machinery, so they may be about the same speed. But basically, the speed advantage that the G3 has goes away, and the Iowa's 16-inch 50 caliber guns have significantly greater penetration capabilities than the G3. G3's guns, although still the G3's guns will do more damage per hit, again assuming similar detonation areas. However, the loss of the speed advantage and the considerably greater punching power of the Iowa's guns to a fairly large degree negates the fact that the G3 is better protected in that particular matchup, because the greater penetration of the 16-inch 50 quite significantly overmatches the increased protection levels that the G3 enjoys, albeit that the fact that the Iowa's own armour is the same as South Dakota's does mean the G3 has a fairly reasonable chance of hurting it if they manage to score a hit, again at practical battle ranges, as demonstrated during the World War II period. So whilst it definitely wouldn't be a one-sided fight, overall I would have to give the second matchup as advantage Iowa. Largely just on the basis that Iowa has a slightly broader range of engagement options, given the ridiculous penetration capabilities of its armament when you're talking about the outer edges of practical battle range. And at that point, both ships have fire control systems that would make hits entirely plausible at those ranges, which means that Iowa has a margin of operation where it's much more likely to get a debilitating hit on its G3 counterpart than the G3 is to get on Iowa. Now, as for the first part of the question with regards to battleship hull shapes, this is to do with a little bit of hydrodynamic theory called wave-making resistance, and that determines, at least at high speeds, it's the dominant factor in determining the drag imposed on the ship by water, which in turn will tell you how much power you need to push the ship through the water for a given speed. Now, when it comes to wave-making resistance, you can have the extremes of completely flush slab sides or completely perpendicular faces. And that's because the rate of change of the hull cross-section relative to the water that it's moving through is what dictates the wave-making resistance. So if you imagine a box going through the water, the sides of the box basically never change because they're completely flush and in line with the line of movement, so they basically have infinitely small wave-making resistance. Conversely, the flat side of the box that's ploughing through the water has infinitely large wave-making resistance because the change is 0 to completely flat pretty much instantly, and so that's really bad, as should be fairly obvious. So you've got that to take into account. And then you've also got to take into account what is you call usable volume on a ship, as well as seakeeping. And these two things are pretty much the reason for the difference in the design between US battleships and British battleships, and a number of other battleships as well. Now, obviously, in the centre of mass of your ship, especially on battleships, which is where all the heavy stuff like the guns and the armour is, you ideally want the most usable volume, which means you want a box. So the most obvious thing to do then is to say, okay, well, that's fine. We'll take a box, and to avoid the fact that, well, the flat face of the box at the front makes for a pretty terrible wave-making resistance, we'll effectively stick a wedge-shaped bow on the front, and with that gradual slow change in cross-section, we'll have relatively low wave-making resistance. Then we'll have loads of a usable internal volume in the middle, and then we can just taper it off at the end. It's fine. You may recognize this concept in the look of the various American battleships, particularly the South Dakota and the Iowa. And that was actually very important in the South Dakota and the Iowa because they had these internal sloped belts. So the actual available volume inside the ship was considerably less than a ship with the same beam but an externally mounted belt. So they needed every cubic foot of space they could get in the citadel area of the ship. So when you look at these profiles, you can see, especially with the two latter ships, which are either side, they have these almost flat sides in the middle and the sort of wedge-shaped bows front and back. Now, the disadvantage of this particular format is that those relatively fine, relatively wedge-shaped bows are absolutely terrible for seakeeping. They're great for speed, but they have very little buoyancy in and of themselves, and that means once you start to get into rough seas, your ship starts to resemble a seesaw very, very quickly, and this is the root of why the Iowa class struggled so much in rough North Atlantic weather when they were on exercises with NATO after the Second World War. Now, by contrast, if you look at the elliptical shape of British battleships, which to a certain degree is also reflected in the North Carolinas, although the North Carolinas is kind of a halfway house between the pure elliptical shape and the box with a wedge shape front that the later US battleships showed, which is why I chose this particular picture. When you're looking at the elliptical shape, you have a very gradual change in cross-sectional area because it's always changing, but not by very much at any given point. So your wave-making resistance is fairly low. Again, it's not as low as the slab sides, but it's still pretty good. And that allows you, therefore, to get relatively good efficiency out of your, for speed, so efficient use of power. It does reduce your hull volume slightly because obviously the hull starts to curve back in near your main armament, so this is another reason why you'd end up quite often with externally mounted belts, although it's one of the more minor considerations, all things told. And the big advantage of it is that if you go with this elliptical approach, your seakeeping is much better because your bow and your stern are generally fuller. They have more proportional volume compared to the overall volume of the ship, which means they have more buoyancy, which means your ship tends to not seesaw quite as much. Hence why, say, HMS Vanguard could operate alongside USS Iowa in the same weather, but be a much more fightable ship without its front turrets being turned into temporary aquariums. So if you're designing your ships primarily for operations in the Pacific, where, well, obviously there are rough waters in the Pacific, there are rough waters in any ocean, but generally speaking, comparative at least to the North Atlantic and the North Sea, the weather in the Pacific tends to either be relatively calm or, dear Lord above, there's a massive typhoon, cyclone, whatever it happens to be, depending on what area you're in, at which point you're not going to be too worried about fighting anything apart from the elements. So this kind of absolutely speed optimized approach, especially with the Iowa, to give maximum volume and protection, especially taking into account the limitations of the internal sloped belt. Works perfectly for a battleship that's designed for the Pacific, but once you start operating in really heavy seas, as a matter of par for the course, like you do in the North Atlantic and the North Sea, it's somewhat less optimal because all the pitching, because of your relatively non-buoyant bow, suddenly means that actually you've lost pretty much all the speed you would otherwise have gained, because of the massive resistance caused by that pitching and the water obviously smashing down on your decks and everything. So that okay, fair enough, this has gone on a fair bit, but in a relatively brief format explains some of the hydrodynamic factors that come into the design of ships. So effectively, really, really short version, the British elliptical shape is better at general seakeeping in rough weather, but has less usable internal volume for a given beam amidships, whereas the US type design in the South Dakotas and the Iowas gives much more usable volume in the Citadel area amidships, and is sort of very, very finely tuned for speed, especially in the Iowas, but is significantly worse at seakeeping and therefore is more likely to lose speed and be a less fightable ship if you're operating in rough weather. And now on to the Patreon questions. Brad asks, I saw a mechanical fire control system in a museum recently. It was a cube of gears several feet in each direction. Can you explain how the early evolution of these systems occurred? Training the crew to use and maintain such systems must have been complex. Mechanical fire control computers are a very interesting subject. At some point, they will have their own kind of big special. But hey, you asked your question this month. I will try and answer it this month, even if it's a relatively truncated version. So the base form of the fire control computer comes about from the fact that to give an accurate firing solution over the kind of ranges that guns were now getting able to reach in the early 20th century, you needed to solve quite a number of equations. Now, any single one of these equations was usually fairly easy to solve. Well, pretty much all of them were related to the old speed equals distance over time and the various permutations thereof. But, as I said, there were a number of them, which would need a number of people to solve, and they kept changing. The variables that you would input would keep changing, which means the results would keep changing, which in turn would mean that you'd forever be sort of several tens of seconds behind what reality actually was. Back in the old day, when speeds were relatively lower and distances were much shorter, so the flight time of shells was not something you had to worry about too much, you could look at a table and just go, right, well, the enemy is this distance away, so I need to elevate my guns to this angle for the range, and I estimate he's moving at about, say, 12 knots, so that's just a little bit of lead. Job's a good one. Now, as ships got faster and faster, this became a lot more difficult. So, to give you some idea, a relatively long but not completely exhaustive list of the equations you'd need to solve for are: how fast are you going? Because once you get up past anything much more than an average human running pace, that is actually going to affect where your shells land, because you're imparting a certain degree of horizontal momentum, obviously depending on where your guns are pointing relative to where your ship is going. So yeah, how fast you're going, how fast your enemy is going, because that's going to affect where they are. And once you know those two things, you've now got to work out what course are you on and what course is your enemy on. Because with the distance having gotten longer, that the shell, by the time the shell flies out, not only are you having to adapt for where the shell's going to land as a result of your movement, but your enemy will have moved considerably from the point where where they were when you fired the gun. So you've got to aim the gun basically for a deflection shot, but a deflection shot that takes into account of your own movement as well. The course is important because obviously it's not just relative speed, it's relative direction. So if you're, say, both moving at 18 knots and you're parallel to each other, then relatively speaking, you're static, everything cancels out, and you can just lead for a little bit. Whereas if you're moving 18 knots opposing each other, you need to be aiming a fair bit ahead of the enemy ship. And if you're both moving at 18 knots and you're closing on each other, it's another different equation entirely. And if you're moving away from each other, it's another different equation entirely. So you've got to work out basically the course of both ships and therefore the modifications you need to put in to your guns. Now, coupled with that is the fact that if your relative distances are changing, that also means the shell flight time is going to be different, which means that you have to then work out, okay, so if all these equations are correct for a shell flight time of, say, 15 seconds, but in actual fact, by the time the shell reaches the enemy at the point that I need to aim at, the shell will actually have been flying for 17 seconds because the enemy's moved further away from me than where they are now, that changes the equation again. And all of this, of course, is just predicated on ships going in a straight line on different courses at, well, different speeds. Now, that obviously all changes further if ships begin to turn, because then you have to talk about angular momentum of the ship and how that affects the shells. And that's a much more complex issue, and this is why the firing solutions provided by these computers tended to work better, especially in the First World War, if you stayed on course, because calculating the changes necessary if you're both on straight courses, albeit in different directions and different speeds, is one degree of complexity. If the enemy starts to turn, it adds a massive extra degree of complexity, and if you start to turn as well, that's the complexity of the equations rises almost exponentially. And as I say, so each one of these equations is relatively quick and easy to solve, even by hand. But as I say, they're changing all the time, and there's so many of them. And this is why you'll tend to see that these systems are, as you can probably see with the picture, they have multiple different inputs. So the idea of a fire control computer is that you can put in all these different inputs. You can change those inputs live, and this fire control computer effectively does all the various calculations necessary from the different equations in distinct blocks, and as you get deeper into the system, it meshes them together, applying the various factors, and eventually it spits out a result that basically says, right, well, for all the data that you have provided me, and obviously you need to program in or have coded into the system, bearing in mind this is mechanical coding we're talking about, the performance of your guns in terms of at gun elevation X, I will shoot Y distance in Z flight time. It can then say, well, based on all the information you've given me, you need to point your guns so many degrees to port or starboard, elevate them so at such and such a rate, and then you can fire the guns. The accuracy of these equations, to a large degree, entirely based on the accuracy of the data that you can put in. Now, in terms of training the crew to use and maintain such systems, the maintenance is the much more complicated issue, because you have to understand how the thing works to make sure you can fix it properly if it breaks. If you don't understand how it works, then if it breaks or stops working or gets inefficient, it's like, well, yeah, you have no idea how to put this thing back together, and it's no longer useful. Training the crew to use it was comparatively a somewhat less complicated issue, because you basically just have to tell them, right, you put this number in when officer whatever says that the course is so many degrees, the speed is so many knots, etc. You can actually train a crew to operate the thing relatively quickly and easily, albeit that obviously they won't be quite as efficient as an experienced one. In terms of the evolution, as I say, I've kind of gone over the basics of the various equations that need to be used. So how it evolved is basically starting off with the constant calculation of one or two of those factors, And as things got more and more complex, the various fire control systems would add more and more factors as the technology advanced to be able to do that, and also would refine the accuracy of those calculations more and more, because with more complex systems you can get more accurate results from your calculations, because it can factor in all sorts of little hidden issues that you might not initially be able to take into account. So some of the things I didn't mention before would be things like wind speed, because again, at the distances you're going, the wind speed and direction might affect the flight of your shells. Also, later on, latitude and longitude of both you and your target, because of the Coriolis effect of the Earth. The rotation speed of the Earth at long distance naval gunfire actually has a bearing on where the shells will land, because not only has the ship that you're targeting moved, the Earth itself has physically moved and is no longer in the same location that it was when you fired the shells. So all of these, and obviously that effect differs depending on how close or far away you are from the equator. So all of these additional things had to be factored in. And once people had worked out what those equations actually were and how to translate that into a mechanical computer setup, you could then develop a new version of the fire control computer that would include these additional factors, and thus accuracy increased. Furthermore, you can never get perfect, because at the end of the day you can only put in a given subset of values, and over the distances that naval shells flew by the time you got to the sort of First and Second World Wars, there would be all sorts of things that you physically cannot measure from the capital ship. Things like the temperature of the guns. Now these days we might be able to measure it, but back then they couldn't. Relative temperature of the shell, exactly the exact weight of the charges, the moisture content of the air, the air pressure. You could read that, and some of the later fire control computers could take that into account. The fact that if you're firing shells so high into the air to come back down much further away, there might be different winds, different air temperatures, different pressures, different moisture and humidity levels at different points along the shell's flight course, and all of these things, most of which you couldn't measure then, and a lot of those you still can't measure now from the ship that you're on, all affect the shell's flight to a certain degree. It may not be a tremendous amount given the overall distance the shell is travelling, but it might be enough to throw the shell off target. And yeah, so this is the gradual evolution of these systems, and hopefully that answers your question to a degree. And finally, for today, Jorg2 asks, as you've said before, Bismarck isn't a good design, but given the resources of Germany at the time, what would you design to satisfy Hitler's need for big battleships? Well, if I'm looking for a slightly more efficient design, and I'm left with the situation that Nazi Germany was in the 1930s, and I absolutely have to give Hitler a big battleship, and I've got a certain degree of latitude available. Now, obviously, I can't go to the French or the British because of the tensions and rivalries there, but I am allied with the Italians, and the Italians are building a class of battleships that, to a relatively great extent, are arguably a superior design to the Bismarck. They have some fairly major weaknesses, but if it's me, I would probably say, okay, let's get the Italian ship designers in with the Littorio design as a base design, because acknowledging that Germany has probably lost more than a critical amount of battleship design experience. And using the Littorios as a base, I would then modify them to my specifications. So what would I do? Eliminate the Italian torpedo defense system. I mean, discussions about whether or not it worked aside, it's simply, again, too inefficient. It's far too large for what it does. Everything else aside. So ditch that. Again, the slightly weird armor, theoretically decapping armor system of the Littorios, again, arguments over its effectiveness aside, it is too heavy, it takes up too much space. Delete that as well. So what do I do then? I would add a relatively simple, considerably thicker outboard slab armour belt. Well, if you want to take over the turtle deck, if that's what Germany's obsessed with, I guess you can, but I prefer a single thick armour deck on top of the belt, but I'm not really fussed one way or the other. Given in mind I'm designed for Nazi Germany, so I've got to make some concessions here. I'd install the more normal German torpedo defense system. So between those changes and factors, I've increased the internal volume considerably. I've got either better or similar or superior protection for less weight, and my torpedo defenses are relatively good. At which point, I now have the space inside the ship to put in more fuel, which will help with the range issues. And I now also have the ability to replace, obviously, I'd replace the Italian guns with the German guns. I mean, both are high velocity 15-inch guns. They're both relatively good, but whilst the German shells have issues with actually detonating, they have somewhat fewer issues, at least at the start of engagements, with actually hitting things. So yes, I would keep the triple turrets, but replace them with the German 15-inch gun. To be honest, I'd probably keep the Italian optical fire control systems. And well, the machinery's fine. I can still hit 30 knots. Great. So at the end of the day, what have I got? I've got a ship that is going to be probably at least 3,000 to 5,000 tons lighter than a Bismarck. It's going to be about as quick. It's going to be better protected. It's going to have a similar or better fire control system. I have 4 shafts, so I'm not going to be as vulnerable to what actually killed the Bismarck at the end of the day, which was the that jamming of the rudder, which meant everyone else could catch up with it. I have an additional 15-inch gun, and it's in 3 triple turrets, so that's a more efficient layout. And because I'm starting off from a base design, I'm not having to do the whole thing from scratch, and I'm also not building a ship that's as large, doesn't use as much material, I can afford to build these for less, which means that, okay, fair enough, Germany might not be able to afford to lay down 3 of them at any one go, but at least if I'm building 2, Bismarck and Tirpitz, obviously, under their new design protocol, I'm not spending as many resources, I'm not spending as many Reichsmarks, and those resources can be sent off to do something else. You may wonder why at this point I didn't mention just building more Scharnhorst but with the twin 15-inch guns, but the question did specify satisfying the desire for big battleships, and whilst the Scharnhorst were considerable size vessels, they were still not comparable with treaty battleships, let alone some of the bigger stuff that was coming out at the time, so going with something a bit bigger and considerably more lethal, like a fixed Germanized Littorio, would tick that box. And that is indeed that for this episode of the Drydock. Apologies for not answering quite as many questions as I normally do, but a few of those did require fairly detailed answers, and hopefully you found some of that enlightening. In any case, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video.